Good morning, everybody. We are just starting, and I'm going to give a few seconds because I see we are just at 110 people, and as soon as we get more people, we will start. So just one more minute, please. Well, maybe we should start. I will have a few words of introduction and then we'll start with the lecture. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Allow me to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today. We are delighted that so many of you have joined us. I dzień dobry, dobry wieczór Państwu. Witamy Państwa bardzo serdecznie. Bardzo się cieszymy, że tylu z Państwa dołączyło się do nas. My name is Elizabeth Hunter. I am a president of the Jagiellonian Law Society and also a member of the Kościuszko Foundation, and I will be your moderator today. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Piszelinski, and we are very grateful that Professor Piszelinski accepted our invitation to speak today. This is our fourth webinar in our series, Ethnic Minorities in Polish Lands, and today we will deal with minority of Lemkos and Ukrainians. Jagiellonian Law Society, as you know, is a professional legal organization, and we started this series of lectures because we were interested in the fact that Poland has an enormous diversity over the centuries, and we were interested in how it dealt with this diversity in legal ways, in terms of governance, in terms of concepts of republican governance, toleration, etc. So this is our fourth lecture, and we are expecting to have many more. The next lectures will be about Kashubians, Germans, and several other minorities. Sadly, today is a very sad day. In light of recent events and the naked aggression of Putin on Ukraine. We will deal with this topic later in the Q&A session, so if you have any questions about that, we will address them at the end of Professor Piszelinski's lecture. Especially, we can discuss recent Putin's article on historical unity of Russia and Ukraine, which is based on 1,000 years of lies about history, and a kind of mythical storytelling and magical history, and essentially ethno-nationalistic propaganda. So we will address that in Q&A, and also as his recent address yesterday. Let me acknowledge people who have helped to make this seminar possible. First of all, I want to thank the Jagiellonian Law Society and the members for supporting our efforts. I want to thank the wonderful Kościuszko Foundation, especially the president of the Kościuszko Foundation, Marek Skulimowski, and the vice president of cultural affairs, Ewa Zadborna. And I also want to thank my chapter, Philadelphia chapter, which has been always very supporting. There were several other cultural institutions and legal institutions who have supported various lectures, and we thank them as well. And finally, least but not last, I want to thank the law firm of Cohen Seglias for letting us to use their Zoom facility, and a wonderful Olivia Paris-Korniłowicz for managing all those things for us. Couple of words about logistics. Today's event will consist of a lecture and a Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them to Q&A. Use the Q&A button at the very bottom of the presentation of the screen, and submit them to me. I will combine them and I will submit them to Professor Piszelinski at the end of the lecture. If you want to know more, please go to our webpage or to the Kościuszko Foundation webpage. We will post the video and we will post Professor Piszelinski's slides. In addition, just a small announcement, kind of advertising. We are interested in starting a new series of lectures on Polish legal thought and the contribution of Polish legal thought into international law. Poland actually has made over centuries quite significant contribution to international law, and they are largely unknown in the West, kind of like the history of the region as well. In any event, this is just something, if you're interested, you will find the information on our website as well. So let me now introduce you to Professor Piszelinski, our distinguished speaker, whom you all came to hear today. Professor Piszelinski is a Polish historian, currently a professor at the University of Rzeszów. He is the chief of the unit of recent history in the Institute of History, and his main area of research is Polish-Ukrainian relations in 20th century, very appropriate. He is author of over 60 scientific publications, and instead of reading them to you, please go to our website, and his publications are listed on our website, so you can go and read them. And I also would add one tidbit, one information. Professor Piszelinski is an accomplished chess master. He is actually silver and bronze medal winner in various chess competitions, and 6-time gold medal winner in a team competition in various competitions. So it's very, we are very honored to have you, Professor Piszelinski, with us. And now I will allow Professor Piszelinski to start the lecture, and please share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Elżbieta. First, I want to say that the situation in Ukraine and Russian aggression made me very sad. So forgive me for my speech. Maybe it will be not so fluent, but I try to say about the Ukrainians in Poland. To understand the origins of Ukrainians in Poland, Ukrainians minority in Poland, we need to reach deeper into the past. Over the centuries, the fate of
Professor Piszelinski, 1 second. Could you please share your screen, because we're not seeing your slides, sir?
No.
Oh, you don't want to share them yet? Okay.
No,
okay.
no, not yet.
Okay,
yes?
Of course. Sorry. Go ahead, sir.
I tried. Over the centuries, the fate of both communities was intertwined with strong bonds because they lived in the same territories. This past still influences the Polish-Ukrainian relations. The country from which Ukrainians derive their tradition, Kievan Rus, the largest country in Europe at that time, was established in the 9th century, whereas the Polish state a century later. So as you see, I can share you the map. Yes, I found them. Yes, sure. No, not yet. Oh, you see, maybe.
Yes, and if you could put it in a screen, if
yes.
kind of.
Here is Kievan Rus in 11th century. As you see, this is part of nowadays Poland. Yeah. And so at the time, the border, you can see it better on the map of Poland. At the time, the border between both communities ran along the Wisła River from my hometown, Rzeszów, and next today's Lublin and Podlasy region. One of the main cultural differences between Poles and so-called Ruthenians was the fact that the Poles adopted Christianity according to Western Latin rite, and Ruthenians according to Eastern Orthodox line. In the 14th century, the Polish king Casimir the Great joined the neighboring western part of Russia, the Principality of Galicia and Volhynia, called Red Ruthenia. The rest of territory of nowadays Ukraine was seized up by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But later, in the same century, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania got united. In this way, a multi-ethnic empire was established. see the map of the with the today's borders of countries in Europe. As you see, the Poland and territory of Ukraine was were in this time in the same kingdom, so called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Over the centuries, Polish noblemen and peasants settled on this land, and the Ruthenians light were colonized. Migration of population were held also in opposite direction. Orthodox Ruthenian shepherds arrived in Western Carpathian region from the east. Their descendants were considered to be the group of Carpathian Highlanders, Hutuls, Boykos, Lemkos. The latter inhabited the area of today's Poland from Krynica in the west to the Bieszczady Mountains. You can see here the light blue is Lemkos territory and the dark blue is the Boykos. Other is the Polish group, ethnographical groups. So the Lemkos, although they dialect was classified as a dialect of Ukrainian language, the significant number of Lemkos didn't feel the Ukrainian, but the separate nation. When towards the end of the 18th century, the partition of Poland were conducted by neighboring powers, Austria, Prussia, and Russian Empire. You can see it on the map. The territory of Red Ruthenia was included within the borders of Austria as the eastern part of this province with its capital in Lviv. The rest of territory of Ukraine, right bank Ukraine, was the part of Russian Empire. In the 19th century, the Ukrainian national movement emerged in Galicia. National identities concentrated around the religion. So Greek Catholics adopted a Ukrainian identity and Roman Catholics a Polish one. So in the fight of the rights, Ukrainians competed with Poles who dominated the province. In the countryside, life generally went on without major conflicts. Both communities lived side by side and also involved in stronger relations. Despite religious differences, the church holidays were celebrated together. People worked together, played, and got married. In some parishes, the proportion of interfaith marriages in which one spouse was Greek Catholic and the other Roman Catholic was as high as 30%. According to tradition, in such marriages, daughters were baptized in their mother's right and sons in their father's right. In this way, ethnic boundaries passed through families and bands. The most famous family, aristocratic family, was the family of Szeptycki, which two sons were Poles, and second two sons were Ukrainian Greek Catholic monks, and stay for Ukraine in this time. To say even simpler, for example, in this family, one of the sons, Roman Szeptycki, as an Andrzej Szeptycki, was the head of the Greek Catholics metropolitan in Lviv, and his brother Stanisław was the chief of Polish army during the war. So, but it's not so often, of course. At the end of and the end of World War I, both Poles and Ukrainians made attempt to create their own statehood. Neither nor or the other nation wanted to give up Lviv, the national and cultural and religious center for Poles and Ukrainians alike. The former Poles emerged victorious from the bloody war that had cost the lives of 10,000 Poles and 15,000 Ukrainians, and ultimately divided the two communities in Galicia. As a result of the war, about 5 million Ukrainians found themselves within the border of the Polish state, 16% of all citizens of interwar Poland. They were most numerous national minority and the most troublesome one. They constituted the majority of the population in 4 southeastern voivodeships. Here the map of Poland, interwar Poland, and this dark brown in the map, color dark brown is over the 70% till 85% of people who used Ukrainian language. Ukrainians did not accept the loss of their own statehood. Most of the Ukrainian elite opted for political methods of combat, but the extremists from the organization of Ukrainian nationalists attacked the structures of Polish state, set places on fire, made assassination attempt in which 63 persons died, including Minister of Internal Affairs. The response of Polish authorities took the form of repression and discrimination of the entire Ukrainian community. They were also attempt to Polonize the Ukrainians. The Second World War strongly deepened mutual animosities. The defeat of Poland in 1939 was accepted with the hope of gaining their own statehood by many Ukrainians. They were under the illusion that the Germans would help them in this matter. Poles took this attitude as a betrayal. The Nazi occupation authorities willingly used the Polish-Ukrainian conflicts for their own purpose. The climax of the conflict took place in the eastern borderlands of the former Poland. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists at the beginning of 1943 formed a partisan unit called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Poles were perceived as a rival to the same territories, so it was decided to remove them at any cost. The Ukrainian underground murdered almost 100,000 Poles, often in a cruel way. This ethnic cleansing, having all the features of genocide, lasted until the end of the German occupation. In the spring of 1944, the conflict moved to the territory of today's Poland, the Lublin region and the Bieszczady Mountains, and caused the lives of several thousand Poles and Ukrainians killed in mutual attacks. In the same 1944, after the finish of German occupation, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, with the consent of the great powers, established the Polish-Soviet border on the so-called Kherson Line. About 600,000 people belonging to Ukrainian nationality lived with the new borders of Poland, including in it over 100,000 Lemkos. They constituted the majority of the inhabitants of the border areas from Krynica to Małopolska. You can see the Ukrainian map with the territory. This red point is Lublin, second is Rzeszów. So it was the eastern and south part of Polish territory. Poland found themselves in the Soviet spheres of influence. The Soviet established a communist-dominated and fully obedient regime in Poland. The Polish army was fully controlled by Moscow, with higher commanders delegated from the Soviet Red Army. Moscow imposed an agreement on mutual exchange of people. Owing to this, Stalin wanted to evacuate Poles from the territory of Ukraine and bring in Ukrainians from Poland instead. The new Polish authorities were also interested in getting rid of Ukrainians. They hoped that consequently they would eradicate Ukrainian partisans. So the population was supported by Western leaders, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as a radical but the only effective way to avoid Polish-Ukrainian conflicts. At the beginning, the Soviet, we can say that the Polish and the Poles and Polish and Soviet authorities wanted to resettle all the Ukrainians and Lemkos from the territory of Poland. But only some Ukrainians declared their willingness to leave Poland. But under the pressure of Poles and Soviets, by the end of summer 1945, 250,000 people left Poland for Ukraine. Many of them were Lemkos. The rest did not want to leave their homeland. Under pressure of Moscow, the Polish government decided to forcibly resettle the rest of them using the Polish army. So it was not sovereign decision of Polish authorities, but the resettlement of Ukrainians was supported by the majority of Polish society, freeing Ukrainians guerrillas. Another 250,000 people were forcibly resettled to Ukraine in the course of a brutal action. Several hundred people died, killed by Polish soldiers. Ukrainian partisans couldn't stop it. The local Poles tried to save their Ukrainian neighbors from leaving, helping them to avoid deportation. About 30% Ukrainian avoided resettlement to Ukraine, hidden, for example, in the forest. The majority of them was loyal to the Polish authorities. Some of them were even communists. But still some of Ukrainians supported the Ukrainian underground. This served Polish authorities as a pretext to organize a military operation called Operation Vistula, aimed at the liquidation of Ukrainian underground. In order to achieve this, it was planned to resettle forcibly the entire Ukrainian population as well as mixed families. After Moscow had refused to accept them, it was decided to deport them to the former territories of the German Reich, so-called regained lands incorporated into Poland, from where the Germans had previously been displaced. The troops used to surround the villages inhabited by Ukrainians and ordered them to prepare for departure within a few hours. The youth and family members of the partisans were interrogated and tortured in order to obtain information about the guerrillas. In total, over 140,000 people were resettled, among them also several thousand Poles, mainly from mixed families. 4,000 people, including the elderly, women, and children, were placed in a labor camp in Jaworzno. They were kept for several months in terrible conditions and brutally interrogated. 161 persons died there in this camp. Polish military courts sentences several hundred people to death, not only for belonging to Ukrainian underground, but also for providing them with food and medicines. The Operation Vistula, in the collective memory of the displaced and all Ukrainian community has been the greatest tragedy of it to this day. Undoubtedly, the principle of collective responsibility was applied to Ukrainians, and the deportation itself, in accordance with modern principles of international law, should be classified as a crime against humanity. The settlement of the entire Ukrainians and the intensive action of the army against the partisan forced the leadership of the Ukrainian underground to demobilize the troops. Hence, to this day, a large part of Polish society is convinced that without the deportation of the Ukrainian, it would not have been possible to defeat the Ukrainian partisan. You can see on the photo the transport of with the staff of the deported people. The greatest number of people were deported to Warmia and Mazuria and to Western Pomerania. The deportees were dispersed, single families were settled in different villages to prevent conspiracy and also enable them to assimilate easier. Inhabitants of one Lemkos village, Florenka, were displaced in 30 villages in 6 Polish districts, like American counties. They ended up in ruined and looted farms. All deported were treated with deep suspicion as potential bandits. They were not allowed to cultivate their culture and religions. It was only after a few years that the restrictions imposed on the displaced were loosened. The communist Polish authorities unofficially admitted that the deportation had been a mistake and allowed those who wish to return. They couldn't, however, regain their farms. Hence, only a dozen% or so of the previously deported returned to their homeland. It was still impossible to write openly about the harms suffered by displaced. On the other hand, in abandoned areas, the communist authorities were covering the traces of the Ukrainian past. Polish settlers were brought there. Part of Orthodox churches were handed over to the Roman Catholic Church, and the remaining were generally dismantled or were allowed to be destroyed. Even the name of the places were changed to sound like Polish one. For example, Uście Ruskie is transferred to Uście Gorlickie, Berechy to Brzegi, and others, and so on. The communists did not manage to develop the post-Ukrainian territories effectively. They remain depopulated to this day. Over 100 villages ceased to exist completely. Others were often inhabited by only few families till now. Towards the end of communistic rule, thought about the necessity of reconciliation with Ukrainians emerged in the Polish Solidarity opposition movement, which gained support of Pope John Paul II. It was inspired by the concept of emigre periodical Kultura, published in Paris, especially by its editor-in-chief Jerzy Giedroyć and the writer Juliusz Mieroszewski. After the fall of communism in 1989, the Polish elite, regardless of their political orientation, supported the aspiration for independence of Ukraine. In December 1991, Poland was the first country in the world to recognize Ukraine as an independent country. To this day, Poland remains one of the greatest proponents of Ukraine's sovereignty, as it is now, against Russian aggression. It is, de facto, one of the few issues on which both the ruling Law and Justice Party in Poland and the opposition agree. Return to the situation of Ukrainians minority nowadays Poland, we should say that in last census in 2011, a total of 50,000 people declared Ukrainian nationality and over 10,000 people Lemkos identity. This would testify of the far-reaching processes of Polonization among the displaced and their descendants. The majority of them live outside the area from which they had been deported. You can see it, the dark blue is the territory which were the only 6% of Ukrainians. Most of them are on the territory where they were displaced after the operation of this war. As you see, the majority of them live in Warmińsko-Mazurskie voivodeships, and the only 15% live in southeastern Poland, so-called Lemko region, and the territory from where they were deported. Almost half of Lemkos live in the Dolnośląskie voivodeships, it's here, in this place, and only quarter of Lemkos in the so-called former Lemkos region, Lemkowina or Lemkivщina. After the fall of communism, Lemkos and Ukrainians have complete freedom to cultivate cultural distinctiveness, just like other national minorities in Poland and just like in other democratic countries in Europe. The Polish state finances schools with Ukrainian as the language of instruction, subsidize Ukrainian social and cultural organization. Unlike before the war, Ukrainians participate in Polish social and political life. They are diplomats, politicians, local activists. After the communist era had ended, Polish and Ukrainian historians undertook intensive research on the common past, including the post-war relocation and the fate of Ukrainian minority. The research project, joint research project and conferences has been undertaken. Most of Polish researchers criticize the post-war resettlement and consider it unjustified repression. In August 1990, the upper house of Polish parliament, the Senate, adopted a resolution condemning the Operation Vistula. But Polish society is still divided over the assessment of the post-war resettlement. While liberal circles condemn it, recognized as a communistic crime, others opposed to this opinion and justified this decision. One of the reasons for this is also the expectation that Ukrainian authorities will apologize for the crimes and genocide of Ukrainian nationalists of Poles in Volhynia. Hence, a similar resolution has not been adopted until today by the lower house of Polish parliament. There were also no compensation payments delivered to people for resettlement. Only former prisoners of Jaworzno camp received special pensions. Finally, I should say that at the beginning of the 90s, many people from Ukraine came to Poland in search for a better paid job. Immigration intensified, especially after Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2014. 3 years later, there were approximately 1.5 million Ukrainian citizens living and working in Poland. But I think in this situation, it still be much more. I finished my short speech about Ukrainian minority in Poland and can answer your questions.
Thank you, Professor Piszelinski. I have a little bit of a computer issue right now because my screen for some reason turned black, so I don't see you guys, but if you can see me and hear me, I'll continue with our presentation. So can you guys see me and hear me? Can you see me, Professor Piszelinski?
Yes, I see you and hear you.
Okay, fine. So I'll just go without the screen. So there are several questions that have come in. Unfortunately, I cannot see them right now, but I took note of them. And maybe we can start with kind of contextualizing a little bit what you said, because maybe we should start with first of all, with a couple of words. Rush versus Russia. These are often confused concepts. Rush or Rutenia is a country or a group of people or a culture that developed in the area around the Kiev. And Professor Piszelinski didn't go that early, 2 centuries earlier in his presentation. He started in around 1100. But Kievan Rus was one of the earliest Slavic countries that developed in the non-Roman Empire occupied areas of the empire. And Kievan Rus developed under Viking influence. And Russia, on the other hand, was called Muscovy or Moscow. And for many of you, many Americans, especially, people confuse Russia and Rus. Muscovy changed its name to Russia only under Peter the Great, which is very, very late. So that's number one thing that I thought may be helpful for people to know. The second thing is that Russia, the Muscovy or Russia, was far more Asian-based power, and they reached the Pacific, and they reached Alaska, they reached the United States long before they extended their power into the area of what is called right now Belarus or Ukraine or Poland. This came much later. Also, the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is the incredible diversity that existed in those lands, because like in around the year 1000, almost entire Europe is Christianizing, and especially Northern Europe, the areas of what we call Scandinavia today, or the Central and Eastern Europe. And actually 2 countries, the Great Moravia, which is now in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia, or Kiev and Rus were the first two Slavic countries that Christianized, and Poland took their Christianity actually from them. And these were the original Slavic countries. And they were kind of destroyed during the Mongol invasions. And later on, and they joined, Professor Piszelinski had a very good slide, when Poland entered in the Union of Lublin with Lithuania. At the time, originally, part of Lithuania consisted of Ukraine, which is now today the area of Belarus and Ukraine. However, when the Polish-Lithuanian Union was concluded, and Professor Frost had a very good lecture on the topic, Poland became the owner. The Kingdom of Poland became the owner of Ukrainian lands, whereas the Duchy of Lithuania became smaller. And that's an important point, because there is lots of confusion about where Ukraine historically belonged. And between 1569, so from the Lublin Union till about 1648, Poland had expanded into area of Ukraine, and the upper classes, as Professor Piszelinski said, became Polonized, spoke Polish, but there was tremendous diversity, religious, ethnic, because there were many more versions of different churches. There was Russian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox, and there were Unites and what have you. And there was a large Jewish population. There was Muslim population, etc. So this was fairly complex situation, and people existed with what Professor Frost was talking to us about, the Polish toleration, the Warsaw Compact, the whole idea of toleration. And all that changed with Counter-Reformation, where, which essentially resulted in the oppression of the original Ruthenian, which we would call the Belarusian or Ukrainian population now. And Ruthenians were quite oppressed. They were forcefully Christianized in the Catholic rite. And that led to the 1648, the Khmelnytsky uprising. And anyways, that led essentially to the end of Poland, the partition, etc. And only one more point that I wanted to add, that USSR, the Soviet Union, did recognize, Putin's lie is a very clear lie, that there was this unity of Russia and Ukraine. Actually, that's not true. There was much more unity between Ukraine and Lithuania and Poland. But when Soviet Union was created in 1922, they actually recognized that these were independent countries by incorporating, creating the state as a federation of republics. So the borders and the people were recognized. Of course, the USSR was controlled by the Soviet regime, but nonetheless, the republics were recognized. And so that's another thing. So I wanted to ask you, Professor Piszelinski, because in light of all this complex diversity, what we are seeing here is a confusion between concept of nationality, ethnicity, identity, political entity, and if you can speak to it, because people are confusing those terms, and they are basically, Putin at least, it's claiming that everybody who speaks Russian is therefore Russian and therefore has a right to be controlled by Russia. But as you just said in your own lecture, we have lots of people who have intermarried, had mixed marriages, both religious rights, or 3 or 4 types of religious rights were observed in the same families. And how do we go about this kind of misinformation, especially that we are seeing in the West? How we address that, and what do you think we should be doing about it? And how would you divide those concepts about those various identities and various concepts? And I'm sorry I cannot see you, so I don't know if you're seeing me or not. You're hearing me as well.
First, I want to say that the Kievan Rus was the older state than Moscovia, also called Moscow Principality. Kievan Rus was established in 9th century, and Principality of Moscow starts from 12th century, 3 centuries later. First information about Moscow as a city was from 11th century. So this time, Moscow, Principality of Moscow, Grand Principality of Moscow even, was only one part of fragmented Kievan Rus, only one small part. Right. Of course, they captured other in next centuries. They captured other Russian territory of Kievan Rus, and they went to Pacific, as you say, but it was still the territory of nowadays Ukraine was in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for more than 3 centuries, longer than the same territories after the partition of Poland in the Russian Empire. Right. So it was longer in the territory, especially Red Ruthenia was in Poland, in Polish kingdom for nearly more than 4 centuries, much more longer than in Russian and even Austrian Empire. And they lived with the quiet tolerance, because Polish landowners and for noblemen, for example, found and subsidized Orthodox churches for their peasants. Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, was first Western state from Western Union with Western Latin Roman Catholics, right? In which the many inhabitants of which were Orthodox, and they were quite normal situation for centuries. So because of it, we set another question which is raised in this is that the today's aggression of Russia, of Russian Federation, was not first, but I think 4th or 5th, even 5th aggression, because the Ukrainian state was established in 1917, what was the first Ukrainian National Republic, and this time Soviets, Bolsheviks attacked them twice. First, before the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and after collapse of German after the First World War I. So in 2014, it was the 3rd aggression from Russia into Ukrainian lands. We can't forget it.
Right.
But what we say about identity, the identity is not belonged only to religion or to language alike, because, for example, the Poles and Lithuanians divided by only by language, not by religion. Both nationalities are Roman Catholics. And we divided with Ukrainians by regions and language. What we should say that even now, Ukrainian is united nation, even is divided by religion question on Greek Catholics on the West and Orthodox on the East. Even some, even about 20% of citizens of Ukraine speaks Russian. They feel Ukrainian. They feel Ukrainians, and they feel Ukrainians, not only Ukrainian citizens, they feel Ukrainians themselves. We should remember that in 1991, during the end of the communistic time, in a referendum in Ukraine, 90% of citizens voted for independence of Ukraine. Big part of them were Russian-speaking inhabitants. So I think it's the most important about the identity, religion, and origins. So not only religion and language, but the history, the tradition, for example, the dialect decided about the identity. And the main thing is that the people have the freedom to decide which nationality and which state they want. So Russians couldn't capture the identity of Ukrainians. This what Putin said 2 years later. 2 years ago, 2 days ago, it was a big liar. Simply, it was not true.
Right. Thank you for that, Professor Piszelinski. That's very great clarification. I have another question for you. So we have received some questions through email. Some questions are coming through Q&A right now. People are asking about the distinction between Ukrainians, Oikos, Lemkos, and Hutsuls, because all those four names are used sometimes interchangeably. We know that these were kind of nomadic herding people coming from the Carpathia area, but could you distinguish? I mean, are those real distinction or are this regional distinction? Or so can you explain a little bit more about that?
Hutsuls, Oikos, and Lemkos, it is the distinction of ethnographical kind. They are different ethnographical kinds. For example, like Górale or Kashubi in Poland. But Hutsuls and Oikos feel Ukrainians, and they are part of the Ukrainian nations. Different situation is with Lemkos, because some of them, for example, about half of Lemkos community in nowadays Poland, feel themselves as separate nation. We should start at that. We should start with at the beginning that the territory of Lemkos was among the Polish territory and Slovakian territory nowadays. The Highlanders, Lemkos Highlanders, lived on the both sides of Carpathian Mountains, on the Polish and now Slovak part. But they, until the end of the World War II, most of Lemkos on the both sides of Carpathian Mountains felt separate Russian. Among them was free orientation in this time. First was Moscow feelings, so-called. They believed that it was strongly connected with Russian Pan-Slavism this time. It was at the beginning of the 20th century. The supporters of this orientation felt themselves as a part of Russian community. Russian called them Ruski Mir. Some Lemkos intellectuals even wrote in Russian language. Second option was Ukrainophilia, so call it, especially popular among the Lemkos from the eastern part of Lemkos region, Lemkowina, east of the Dukla Pass in Poland. A lot of them took part in the Ukrainian underground during the and after the World War II. As the third orientation was, first option was, became popular after the war, especially, was that Lemkos are a separate nation. But among the Lemkos who lived now in Canada, in USA, is the idea, for example, Canadian professor Paul Magocci proposed it, that is the one separate nation named Carpathorusins. This nation is parted on the Polish, Slovakian, and part of Western Ukraine now, so call it Subcarpat. In the interwar Czechoslovakia, it was the Subcarpathian Rus. It was sometimes called Fourth Russia. Today, Lemkos are divided between this last option. Some of them feel Ukrainians, and others keep separate identity as Lemkos or Carpathorusins in Polish. For example, Lemkos community in Poland is divided between two organizations, Zjednoczenie Łemków and Stowarzyszenie Łemków. First is Lemkos Ukrainians, second is Lemkos as autochthones simply. Of course, in my opinion, this is not an aim of scientists to decide for Lemkos who they want to be. It's the right of Lemkos to decide of themselves, and they were separated in this. For example, it was a problem in last year. It was problem in Poland because in the Polish Special Commission, Mutual Commission of Government and National Minorities, needed the representative of Lemkos community. But Lemkos couldn't decide from which part of them it would be. Both organizations couldn't agree of the proposition. So Lemkos are divided in Poland, sometimes strongly. So we can say, of course, that some of them are feel Ukrainians, especially, for example, even Lemkos who were deported, resettled after the Second War to Ukraine. Some of them were displaced in Donbass, for example, and some of them are under this aggression now, and they feel Ukrainians, but most of the Lemkos in Poland feel the separate Lemkos, and tried to make the independent language as a language of instruction in schools, for example.
Thank you for that clarification. I have another question for you, slightly different. You mentioned in your slides, the creation of province of Galicia under Austro-Hungarian Empire. And, I just have a question. How did the Austro-Hungarian influence the whole identity formation of the Lemkos, Ukrainians, Poles in those areas? I mean, was there something very special about this Galician period? Because lots of historians talk about this whole Galician interlude, and can you eliminate that a little bit?
The Austrian monarchy used the situation, the difference between in their own purpose, the differences between Poles and Ukrainians. So in Polish was the thought that the Austrian monarchy, Vienna, made the Ukrainian nationality. But most of the scientists wrote that it was impossible to make nation without differences. So the differences between Poles and Ukrainians, based on the religious issue on Greek Catholics or Roman Catholics, it was the base to build Ukrainian identity 19th century, and was independent of what Vienna monarchy wanted to do with it. So the Ukrainian started as in the same time as a nation, which starts, for example, White Russian, Belaruski, the White Russian movement, or a Lithuanian movement, even earlier, in the second half of 19th century, and was strong based on the religious differences of their own tradition and history, of all their own intellectuals. It was not it was not made by the Vienna or the Berlin sometimes.
Right. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yes, no.
Okay. Thank you for that. One of the questions that we got is kind of interesting. It's not exactly on the topic, but more about the current affairs. And the question is, can you comment? And I don't know anything about it, so I'm asking you. Can you comment on Radek Sikorski allegation? So this is a Polish minister, I guess, foreign minister under the previous party, that in 2014, Putin offered to partition Ukraine with Poland. Have you heard of that, or is this just one of those rumors floating in the internet?
I heard of that, but in Poland there is no strong group to accept this. Polish elite can't accept this proposition, because they in Poland now, there is no controversy where the Ukrainian nation exists, and Ukraine should be independent country. So this proposition, I think it was kind of the diversion like green soldiers.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Well, we are all watching the events. President Biden is going to speak soon. I know he's being televised in Poland, the entire Poland, and I'm glad to see both Polish left and right are finally uniting. Everybody is condemning the aggression. And thank you for your lecture today. And unfortunately, we are at time, but it is a fascinating lecture. Thank you for illuminating all those complex issues for us. We are very grateful to you for taking your time and speaking to us today. We are very grateful for all of you who joined us. As I said, we will post the slides, the video of this lecture on our website, and I believe Kościuszko Foundation will do the same. And because there are several other very interesting seminars that are happening right now. In fact, a couple of days ago, there was a lecture at Harvard in the Ukrainian Institute with Professor Timothy Snyder speaking about the Ukraine, a very interesting lecture. We will post the links there so that, you know, if you are interested in those issues, you will be able to go there and take it from there. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Piszelinski. We are delighted you joined us, and visit the websites for more information. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the possibility to say something about the complex Polish-Ukrainian relation in this difficult time. I hope that the whole world support Ukraine in this aggression.
Yes, we all agree on that. Thank you so much, Professor Piszelinski. Thank you, everybody. And goodbye. We'll see you soon at our next lecture.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.